Fences for layouts. Fences are often said to be the thing that causes good neighbours versus bad neighbours. Fences are often overlooked on a layout, but they really lift a layout's features. They're easy and cheap to make. Fence design is similar the world over, so presentation will suit all models of all prototypes. This presentation will describe how to make cost-effective layout fencing. Firstly, examples of fences. This picture here shows a US factory facility with cyclone wire fence around the sides. It also has an activated gate here across the tracks so that the operators have an action task to open and close the gate when they are doing shunting. This facility shows also another type of fencing along the sides of industrial area. There's also fencing, not the cyclone wire type, but the old post and rail, literally, where pieces of old railroad track have been used to create a fencing. There's suburban fences, such as the ones shown here, down the sides and across the back, which is a timber paling type fence. There's this one, there's a paling fence down the sides, and there is also a 2-bar ranch or rail type fence across the front. This one has a concrete fence topped by bricks. Slightly harder to model, but still easily done. And down the sides again, the paling fences. And again, more fences here with 3-bar post and rail fence. Types of fences, as you've seen there, there's cyclone wire fencing around industries. There's 2, 3 or 4 strand barbed wire fences on rural properties. There are split rail timber fences around cattle properties, paling fences around houses, picket front fences, fences made from used rail and brick fences, just to name a few. This presentation focuses on the low-cost methods of fencing. Kit bashing of all types of fencing is also available with lots of fence suppliers such as Walthers, where you can get kits, but these can add up to very expensive if you're fencing large areas on your railroad. Firstly, barbed wire fences. I use skewers or 4x4 strip wood for posts. I paint and stain first with India ink. I then cut the posts about 4 foot long, plus about another 3 to 4 foot to plant them in the ground, using a chopper to simplify the effort and to replicate the large numbers of cut posts. The posts are glued with 8-foot centres using PVA glue, and then I wrap cotton or easy line around to form 4 rows of fencing. And I use weights to keep the cotton or pole line taut until the glues have dried. I find personally that easy line's a bit too stretchy, and if it escapes from you while you're working, it goes everywhere, whereas cotton is much stabler and easier to lay out. Once I've got all the fence strung across, I then align the wires, dragging them up or down slightly on each post with a toothpick. Once they're all aligned and parallel, all the wires, I then use a dab of super glue running down the back of the post where it can't be seen to secure the cotton or the easy line. And then, if I need to, I paint with rust or railroad tie brown, depending upon the age of the fence, to give the cotton the suitable dark colour. Here's an image of some of the items used. The skewers are shown here, and some easy line. As I said before, to do it, I lay the posts out, 8-foot centres, planted in the ground and glued in. I then string the string all the way around, and I use self-locking tweezers or hemostats and other devices to weight the strings till I get them all right and level. You can see here I've used some clothespins to also hold the lines tight, and then I glue them in. Here's an image of a rural fence. In this case, they've used star picket type intermediate posts between each of the timber posts. This can also be done on the layout using a bit of piano wire. I personally have not done it because the piano wire can be a bit of a risk as you drag your arm across the layout. Here is another style, part of the fencing, where they use strainer posts to take up the tension on the ends of the runs of line. And here's another type of strainer post with the sloping 30-degree post, and another type of steel strainer post here. Now moving to cyclone wire fences. As you can see here, What I do is I make up a jig using some scrap timber. I allow 10-foot spaces between the verticals, 6-foot distance on verticals between the top and the bottom rails, plus another 2 foot for the barbed wire on top if I'm using barbed wire on top, and 2 to 3 feet on the bottom to allow planting of the completed fence into the terrain or layout. And I make the rails on the fence with 28 thou brass wire. This is for HO scale. And I solder the brass wire pieces together. This image shows my timber jig where I've marked out the fencing and the brass wire supplies. I tape down the brass wire with just some painter's tape or masking tape, then solder each of the junction points where the wires are using some flux and a reasonable quality solder. Once that's completed, I can lift it off the jig, the fence. I can then plant the fence into the terrain or onto a vertical part of the jig just so that it's held vertically. Then I cut tulle to use as the mesh. Now to cut tulle is a bit of a trick, so I'll explain that in the next slide. And then once the tulle is cut out to the right size, in other words 10 foot by the length of the fence, I attach it to the brass wire using ACC, a clamp with a peg, or I use ACC and some kicker to make it cure rapidly. I then bend the tops of the fence posts outwards from the property so that they can hold the barbed wire. Now cutting tulle is a challenge. If you just try and put a ruler over it and run a blade across it, you'll find it'll bunch and curve and you'll end up with a great curved arc. The trick is to lay down a complete layer of masking tape over the tulle onto your cutting board, then cut the tulle, then peel off the masking tape, and then you get tulle at exactly the right dimensions. Okay, this again shows the cyclone wire fence with the tulle being stretched across the side of the fence and clamped by a clothespin. Making the cyclone wire fence on top for the wire, you can again use easy line or cheap cotton, or you can coil fine copper wire around a screwdriver shaft to make a coiled barbed wire along the top, and I'll show that in the next slide or so. You can then spray paint the fence either grey or old silver, apply weathering with Indian ink washes and weathering powders, and apply any vegetation around the base of the fence. Here shows cotton being strung along, and similar to when doing the barbed wire fences, the knots originally anchored with super glue and then strung along and adjusted and then anchored at the end and glued. Here's again the weights of self-closing tweezers used on the end just to hold tension on the cotton, whilst along the top here the cotton is drying with the super glue. Making the coiled barbed wire fence on the top like razor wire, you just rotate very fine brass wire, or copper wire rather, around the shaft of the screwdriver, many coils, and then you pull it off and just gently tease it out, and you end up with this effect. A bit hard to see, but along here the wire is coiled along the top of the fence and sat across each of those little 2-foot extensions and super glued on. Just to show that there are different variations in fencing and you can do whatever you like on your layouts. This fence shows no bottom or top railing, so they've just used the verticals and strung the material across the sides and put the barbed wire on top. So you could do that on your layouts if you wished to cut out some of the soldering work. This one, the New South Wales Railways don't put the barbed wire on top, they just have the 6-foot high wire fencing running all the way along. So they're just cut off smooth at the top. Here's another example of it. And in this case, they've used organza instead of tulle. Organza gives a square cut pattern, which looks a bit thicker and denser than the tulle. Tulle gives that hexagonal cut. Here is some rail fence that's been just soldered from bits of scrap off-cut rail and then heavily weathered with rust and rust powders. The rail fences, again, quick and easy to make, just offcuts of old rail. After you've laid your track, you solder it up using a jig. And why do you use a jig? Because it gets too bloody hot to hold it if you're soldering it. And then you, as I said, paint it a rust colour, plant it and put some weathering powders on it. Here's the jig I made, which is just using some track pins to hold the rail in place for the soldering process, where it's then soldered down. Another type of fence, post and rail, very simple. It's just drive the posts in to your layout and then place the horizontal rails and then paint it. Here's another type of fence, much more difficult but common in the modern era, where there are vertical pickets on a 6-foot high fence with the spikes at the top. It's a neater way for modern industries to not look so industrial. So, to summarise, there are challenges in building anything, but there are none really when you get into building a fence. It's quite easy. And you can do your dioramas on the workbench to make them much easier to work on, then place them on the layout. If you have that opportunity, if you don't, well, do a bit of bending and stretching, but the fences still make the layout great. Some of the tools I've used, the chopper is essential for cutting out all those little vertical posts, timber posts and such like. Supplies, Easy Line, I get from the local hobby shop for me. Cheap cotton I get from Spotlight, which is a haberdashery chain in Australia. Tulle and organza again from Spotlight, the haberdashery suppliers. Skewers from our local grocery supermarkets, which are Coles and Woolworths. And brass wire from, again, another specialised hobby shop. If you don't want to take up the challenge of building your own fences, you always have the fallback of going to commercially available fencing types. And this shows one from Central Valley. They make quite a range of different types of fencing, which can all be used to build great fences on your layout. Thank you very much for your time.